The first mistake Emily and Jake made was playing the game, a childhood dare whispered about in hushed tones. They were 12, bored, and naive enough to think the stories were just tales meant to scare kids. But the thing about legends is that some of them are true. It was a late October evening, and the siblings were home alone. The old farmhouse creaked with every gust of wind, its drafty halls amplifying the sound of their footsteps. Emily held the flashlight, her fingers trembling slightly despite her feigned confidence. "You scared?" Jake teased, his lopsided grin barely visible in the dim light. "Of course not," Emily snapped, though her voice wavered. "It's just a dumb game." They'd found the rules scrawled in a dusty notebook in the attic, buried under boxes of yellowed newspaper and brittle photographs. It detailed how to summon the hunger of the mirror, a spirit said to grant a wish but at a cost. You needed an antique mirror, a single candle, and an offering of something personal. Jake had brought his favorite baseball card, and Emily clutched a bracelet their late mother had given her. They set the objects on the wooden floor of their parents' room, where an old oval mirror hung on the wall, its ornate frame tarnished with age. The glass seemed to ripple faintly, though Emily convinced herself it was just her imagination. They lit the candle, its flickering light casting distorted shadows across the room. Bravado faltering, Emily unfolded the notebook, her hands shaking. "Wei, chant this 3 times. Mirror, mirror, feed your hunger. Grant our wish and tear asunder." "That's it? That's it," Jake snickered. "Sounds fake. Let's just do it." They knelt before the mirror and chanted the phrase in unison. The first time, their voices sounded awkward and unsure. The second time, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. By the third chant, the candle's flame flared a brilliant blue before extinguishing entirely. The siblings froze, their eyes darting to the mirror. At first, nothing happened. They exchanged nervous glances, relief beginning to set in. Then, the surface of the mirror rippled like water, and a dark, skeletal hand pressed against the glass from the inside. Emily gasped and scrambled backward, while Jake remained rooted in place, his wide eyes fixed on the apparition. What is that?" Emily stammered. The hand was joined by another, and soon a figure began to emerge. Its body was elongated and gaunt, with skin stretched taut over jagged bones. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its grin revealed rows of needle-like teeth. "Who summoned me?" The voice was a rasping whisper, yet it echoed as if spoken in a vast cavern. Jake's voice cracked as he pointed to the mirror. "We did. We want a wish." The creature's grin widened impossibly. "A wish? All wishes require payment." "We know," Emily said, finding her voice. She held out the bracelet with trembling hands. "Here, this is our payment." The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "This trinket is insufficient. The hunger demands more." "But that's what the rules said," Jake protested, his voice rising in panic. The creature let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Rules? The mirror has no rules, only hunger." Before they could react, the creature's hand shot out, shattering the glass as it emerged fully into the room. It moved with a nightmarish fluidity, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it crawled toward them. The siblings screamed, scrambling for the door, but the creature moved faster. It seized Jake by the ankle, dragging him back despite his frantic kicks. It's back, but it didn't even flinch. Desperate, she grabbed Jake's arms and pulled with all her strength. "Let him go!" she screamed. The creature paused, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. "A trade," it hissed. "One stays, one goes." Emily froze, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" "The hunger must be fed. Choose." Tears streamed down Jake's face. "Don't do it, Emily. Run." But she couldn't leave him. Taking a shaky breath, she whispered, "Take me instead." The creature released Jake, who scrambled away, horrified. It loomed over Emily, its grin wider than ever. Brave, but foolish. Before Jake could stop it, the creature wrapped its bony fingers around Emily and dragged her toward the mirror. She didn't scream. She only looked at Jake with tear-filled eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered, as the mirror's surface rippled and swallowed her whole. Jake lunged forward, but it was too late. The mirror returned to its normal state, cracked and lifeless. He pounded on the glass, screaming her name, but there was no answer. Only his reflection stared back, pale and haunted. For days, he refused to leave the room, hoping she might come back. But Emily was gone, and the mirror remained silent. Weeks later, Jake noticed something chilling. In the background of his reflection, just over his shoulder, he could see faint, glowing eyes and a twisted grin watching him. The hunger of the mirror had not been satisfied, and it was still waiting. It started as a flicker, a tiny misstep in her routine. 8-year-old Lily always found comfort in the smooth glass of her bedroom mirror. It was old, an antique handed down through generations, framed in a gilt design resembling interwoven vines. To her, it had always been just a mirror until the day it wasn't. One sunny afternoon, as she brushed her hair, she noticed something odd. Her reflection's hand moved a beat too slow, as if struggling to catch up. Lily froze, her brush halfway through her tangled auburn strands, and watched. The reflection stilled too, matching her now, but her breath quickened. She stepped closer, her nose almost touching the cool glass. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Maybe she had just imagined it. But she hadn't. Over the next week, the mirror began to play tricks on her. When Lily waved, her reflection sometimes smiled before her lips had even twitched. When she twirled, her reflection stopped a second too soon. These moments weren't constant. They were subtle and fleeting, leaving her doubting her own perception. Still, the unease grew like a knot in her stomach. "Mom, Dad," she said one evening, her small voice breaking the silence over dinner. "I hear is something wrong with the mirror in my room." Her mother glanced at her father, suppressing a smile. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Lily fidgeted with her fork. It doesn't always move like me. My reflection sometimes does things before I do, or stops too early. I think it's alive." Her father chuckled. "That's quite the imagination you have there, kiddo. Maybe you've been reading too many scary stories before bed." "No, I am serious," she insisted, her eyes wide with desperation. "It's not just in my head. Please, come look." Her parents exchanged amused glances, but indulged her. Following her to the bedroom, Lily stood in front of the mirror and waved. Her reflection waved back, perfectly synchronized. She spun in a circle, clapped her hands, and even jumped. But the mirror showed nothing out of the ordinary. Her mother bent down, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's face. "See, it's just your reflection, honey. There's nothing to be afraid of." But Lily wasn't convinced. She felt the mirror's wrongness deep in her bones, and her parents' dismissal only made her feel more isolated. That night she lay awake, staring at the shadowed outline of the mirror in the dim moonlight. Her chest felt heavy with dread. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs, like wind rustling through the leaves. Lily sat up, her heart hammering. She strained to listen, but the room was silent again. Clutching her blanket, she turned toward the mirror. The glass seemed darker than usual, almost liquid in texture, and she swore she saw movement within its depth. "Lily?" a voice hissed, barely audible. She gasped, shrinking back against the headboard. The voice was high-pitched, eerily similar to her own but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Lily, come closer." Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am you," the voice replied, and as it spoke, the reflection in the mirror began to shift. Its features remained the same, but its eyes were darker, glinting with something malevolent. "Don't be afraid. I just want to talk." Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You are not me! Go away!" The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening unnaturally. "But I could be. We could switch places. You could live in here, and I could live out there. Wouldn't that be fun?" "No!" she screamed, bolting out of bed and running to her parents' room. But when she woke them, their annoyance outweighed their concern. "You probably had a bad dream, sweetheart," her mother said, rubbing her eyes. "Here is no one in the mirror. Go back to bed." Lily begged to sleep in their room, but her parents insisted she return to her own. Reluctantly, she crept back, her heart pounding with every step. She avoided looking at the mirror, instead crawling under her covers and squeezing her eyes shut. But the whispering returned, louder this time, until she finally fell into an uneasy sleep. Over the next few nights, the reflection grew bolder. It mimicked her less and less, instead standing still while Lily moved, watching her with a predatory gaze. Once, when she reached out to touch the glass, the reflection's hand shot forward faster than hers, its cold, translucent fingers brushing against her skin. She screamed and pulled back, her hand tingling where they had touched. The whispers became a nightly torment. They spoke of how wonderful the mirror world was, how much fun they could have together, if only Lily agreed to trade places. But there was always an underlying menace to the words, a sharp edge that made her skin crawl. The whispers became a nightly torment. They spoke of how wonderful the mirror world was, how much fun they could have together if only Lily agreed to trade places. But there was always an underlying menace to the words, a sharp edge that made her skin crawl. Then, one night, Lily woke to a strange sound. It was a soft scraping, like nails on glass. She sat up, her stomach nodding as she turned toward the mirror. Her reflection was no longer in the glass. Instead, the dark surface rippled like water, and a pale hand reached out, followed by another. Lily froze in terror as her reflection began to emerge, its body impossibly thin and slightly warped, like a funhouse mirror version of herself. The reflection's eyes locked onto hers, and its lips curled into a sinister grin. "It's time," it whispered. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Lily scrambled out of bed, her mind racing for an escape. She bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it, as if an invisible force had willed it so. Behind her, she could hear the soft patter of bare feet on the floor. "Don't run, Lily," the reflection cooed. "You are only making it harder." Tears streamed down her face as she pressed herself against the door, screaming for her parents. But the house remained eerily silent, as if the mirror world had swallowed her cries. The reflection's distorted figure loomed closer, its shadow stretching across the floor. And then, just as its cold hand brushed her shoulder, the world seemed to tilt. Everything went dark. Lily woke up with a start, her head pounding as though she had been thrown into a deep, dark abyss. The room was eerily quiet. At first, she thought it had all been a nightmare, until she noticed the oppressive cold and the strange silvery hue of her surroundings. She was inside the mirror. Her reflection was gone from the glass entirely. Instead, the surface shimmered faintly, a distorted window into her bedroom. She could see her body lying limp on the floor, as the other Lily, the one that had emerged, smoothed her hair and slipped beneath the covers of her bed. "No, this isn't real," Lily shouted, pounding her fists against the glass. But the surface was hard and unyielding. Her cries didn't echo. They were absorbed into the void, swallowed by the strange world around her. The mirror world was a twisted, nightmarish version of a room. The walls were smeared with streaks of shadow, and the furniture looked stretched and warped, as if it had melted and refrozen. The air felt dense, charged with a static energy that prickled her skin. "Hello," Lily called, her voice trembling. A faint giggle came from the darkness. Lily spun around, but she saw no one. "Who's there?" she demanded, her heart thudding in her chest. The giggle grew louder, and then the shadows moved. Figures began to emerge from the corners of the room, distorted versions of herself, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes black pits. They moved jerkily, like marionettes on invisible strings. "You are one of us now," one of them rasped, its voice layered with an eerie echo. "Forever." Lily stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No, I am not staying here." The figures laughed, a chilling cacophony. "You don't have a choice," another whispered, stepping closer. Its hand reached out, skeletal and clawed. Lily turned and ran. her bare feet slapping against the cold, reflective floor. The landscape shifted as she moved, the room stretching into a corridor that seemed to go on forever. The shadows followed, their distorted limbs reaching for her, their laughter echoing in her ears. "Mom! Dad!" Lily screamed, but the words felt hollow, lost in the void. She kept running until her legs burned, her breath ragged in her throat. Finally, she stumbled into a new Roomba-perfect replica of her bedroom, untouched by the warped horrors she had just fled. The air here was still, almost comforting. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, but it's safe for now." The voice startled her. She turned to see a figure sitting in the corner. It was another version of herself, but this one looked kind and sad, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Who are you?" Lily asked cautiously. "I am what's left of the real you," the figure said. "The part that fought against the mirror. How do I get out of here?" The other Lily shook her head. "It won't be easy. The reflection wants your life, and it will do anything to keep you here. But there's a way." "Tell me," Lily pleaded. "You have to shatter the mirror from the inside. It's the only way to break the connection and banish the reflection." Lily's heart sank. "But how? I've tried, it's too strong." The other Lily stood, her form shimmering faintly. "You have to find the core of the mirror, the place where its power is strongest. But beware, it's guarded." Before Lily could ask more, the figure dissolved into mist, leaving her alone. The comforting atmosphere of the room began to fade, the walls darkening and warping once more. She had to move quickly. Lily stepped back into the twisted corridor, her determination outweighing her fear. The shadows watched her from a distance, whispering and laughing, but they didn't approach. She followed an invisible pull, an instinct drawing her deeper into the heart of the mirror world. At last, she reached a grand hall. The walls were made of jagged, crystalline glass, and in the center stood a pedestal. On it rested a glowing shard, the core of the mirror. Lily approached cautiously, her reflection appearing in the jagged walls around her. Each reflection smirked, their eyes glinting with malice. "You can't win," they hissed in unison. "You belong to us." "No," Lily said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I am taking my life back." She lunged for the shard, but as her fingers brushed it, the reflections shattered and reformed into a towering figure, a monstrous amalgamation of her own face and the shadowy creatures she had seen before. It roared, its voice shaking the hall. Lily gripped the shard tightly, its light burning her hand. The monstrous figure lunged, but she didn't hesitate. Summoning every ounce of strength, she raised the shard and drove it into the ground. The mirror world trembled. Cracks spread through the floor, the walls, and the air itself. The monstrous figure let out a deafening scream as it dissolved into shards of light. Lily closed her eyes as the world around her shattered. When she opened them, she was back in her bedroom, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. The mirror was gone, replaced by an empty frame. Her parents burst into the room, their faces etched with worry. "Lily, are you okay? We heard you screaming." Lily smiled weakly, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "The mirror's gone." But as she glanced at the empty frame, she noticed a faint shimmer in the glass and a whisper that only she could hear, for now. The Thompsons were a family of 5. Brian, his wife Linda, their teenage daughter Chloe, and twin boys Max and Sam. When they moved into the sprawling old Victorian house on Willow Street, they thought they had stumbled upon their dream home. The property was vast, the rooms were spacious, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. The previous owner, an elderly woman who had passed away years prior, had left the house almost entirely furnished. Among the peculiarities of the house was an enormous, ornately framed mirror built into the master bedroom wall. Its antique frame was carved with intricate designs, and its glass had a faint, silvery gleam that seemed to shimmer in low light. On the first night, the family was too exhausted from unpacking to notice anything strange. But Max and Sam, ever the curious pair, couldn't resist exploring the house once their parents went to bed. They crept through the dimly lit hallways, giggling as they peeked into each room. When they reached the master bedroom, they froze. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple faintly, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Sam, trying to be brave, stepped closer and tapped on the glass. It felt solid and cold. "It's just a weird old mirror," he whispered to Max. But Max didn't look convinced. He pointed to the faint outline of a shadowy figure in the corner of the mirror. It wasn't them. The boys bolted back to their room. Their excitement turned to unease. They whispered about what they'd seen until sleep finally overtook them. The next morning, over breakfast, they mentioned the strange mirror to Chloe, who shrugged it off. "You two are always imagining things," she said with a smirk. But that night, Chloe found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The house, with its creaks and groans, felt alive in a way that unsettled her. Unable to sleep, Chloe decided to investigate. She tiptoed down the hallway to the master bedroom, her phone's flashlight leading the way. The mirror loomed in the dark, its surface unnaturally reflective. As she approached, she noticed her own reflection, but something was off. Her reflection smiled back at her before she had a chance to react. Chloe stumbled back, her heart pounding. She fled to her room and buried herself under the covers, too terrified to tell anyone. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Brian and Linda began arguing over trivial matters, their usual harmony disrupted by a tense undercurrent. Max and Sam refused to sleep alone and insisted on keeping the lights on at night. Even Linda, who prided herself on being rational, confessed to Brian that she sometimes felt like someone was watching her in the mirror. Then, one evening while preparing for bed, Linda noticed a handprint on the mirror. It was faint but unmistakable, pressed into the upper corner of the glass. She called Brian over, and they examined it together. The print was too large to belong to any of the children and didn't match their own. "Maybe it was there when we moved in," Brian suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "I'd have noticed it before," Linda replied, her voice tight. That night, as the family slept, Chloe woke to a faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the mirror in her parents' room. She crept to their door, her curiosity overpowering her fear. Peering through the crack, she saw the glass vibrating, as though something on the other side was trying to get out. Then came a low, guttural whisper that made her blood run cold. The next day, Chloe confided in Max and Sam. "Something is wrong with that mirror," she said. "I heard it last night. I think it's trying to talk to us." Max and Sam exchanged nervous glances. "We'll show you what we saw," Max said. The three of them crept back to the master bedroom that evening while their parents were distracted downstairs. As they stood before the mirror, Chloe's reflection once again twisted into a sinister grin, independent of her own expression. This time, the twins saw it too. Before they could run, the surface of the mirror rippled violently. A shadowy figure emerged, just for a moment, before dissolving back into the glass. Chloe screamed, and the three of them bolted out of the room. Brian and Linda came running, alarmed by the commotion. "It's the mirror," Chloe cried, tears streaming down her face. Here is something in there." Brian and Linda exchanged worried glances, but decided to humor their children. They inspected the mirror, finding nothing unusual. "It's just an old mirror, sweetheart," Linda said, though her voice trembled slightly. That night, Chloe dreamed of the mirror. In her dream, the shadowy figure beckoned her closer, its voice a chilling whisper. "Come closer," it said. "Let me out." She woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The following day, the family decided to cover the mirror with a heavy blanket. For a brief moment, the house felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. But that night, the blanket fell to the floor, seemingly of its own accord. The mirror's surface glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the room. Max, Sam, and Chloe huddled together in their room, too terrified to sleep. Then, just past midnight, they heard it, a slow, deliberate knock coming from the other side of the mirror. The Thompsons barely made it through the next day. Brian and Linda dismissed the previous night's events as their children's overactive imaginations, but the kids knew better. Chloe couldn't shake the image of her reflection grinning at her. and Max and Sam's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. That evening, the family decided to stay together in the living room, watching television in an effort to lighten the mood. But the laughter felt forced, and the uneasy tension hung over them like a storm cloud. As the clock struck midnight, the television flickered and went static. Linda grabbed the remote and tried to switch channels, but the screen stayed frozen in a snowy blur. Then the sound came, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoing from upstairs. Brian stood, his face pale. "I'll go check," he said, trying to mask his unease. Linda hesitated but followed him, leaving the children huddled together on the couch. As they ascended the stairs, the tapping grew louder. It was coming from the master bedroom. Brian pushed open the door and froze. The mirror was uncovered again, its surface rippling as if it were a pool of water. For a moment, a face gaunt, pale, with hollow eyes pressed against the glass before vanishing. Linda gasped, grabbing Brian's arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Brian nodded, his heart pounding. He stepped closer to the mirror, reaching out as if to touch it, but Linda pulled him back. "Don't," she pleaded. The tapping ceased, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. The couple fled the room, slamming the door behind them. "We're sleeping downstairs tonight," Brian said firmly. Downstairs, the children immediately noticed their parents' pale faces. "What happened?" Chloe asked. "Nothing," Brian said too quickly. "We're all staying in the living room tonight, just to be safe." The family settled in for the night, the living room lit with every lamp they could find. But sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside set them on edge. Then, around 3 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath fogged in the air, and a sudden chill enveloped them. The twins clung to Chloe as the mirror's eerie glow illuminated the stairwell. Shadows began to move across the walls, unnatural and fluid. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the house. "You can't hide from me." Linda screamed as the lights flickered and died. The family clung to one another, frozen in terror. The glow from the mirror intensified, and a figure began to emerge from its surface. It was the same gaunt face Linda and Brian had seen earlier, now attached to a towering, shadowy body that seemed to suck the light from the room. "What do you want from us?" Brian shouted, his voice trembling. The figure pointed a long, bony finger at Chloe. "The girl," it rasped. "She is mine." Chloe screamed, tears streaming down her face, as the figure lunged toward her. Brian grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crash, and the figure dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. For a moment, there was silence. Then the house began to shake violently. Cracks spread across the walls, and the floorboards groaned as if the entire structure was about to collapse. "We have to get out," Linda yelled. The family scrambled for the front door, dodging falling debris and the oppressive darkness that seemed to chase them. As they burst onto the front lawn, the shaking ceased. The house stood eerily still, its windows dark and lifeless. The Thompsons never went back. They left everything behind, moving into a small apartment on the other side of town. Though the events in the house were never spoken of again, Chloe often woke in the middle of the night, convinced she could still hear the faint tapping of the mirror. And sometimes, when she looked into her reflection, she swore she saw it smile. It started as most bad ideas, down with a late-night scroll through the internet. Mia had stumbled upon an obscure forum dedicated to urban legends and stumbled across a thread titled The 5 Candles Ritual. The instructions were simple. Light 5 candles in a circle, ask questions to the spirits, and allegedly receive answers. It sounded ridiculous and thrilling, the perfect recipe for a Friday night with her friends. Mia was the ringleader of their small group, her curiosity always driving them into strange situations. Her best friend, Alex, was the skeptic, rolling his eyes at every ghost story but still tagging along. Then there was Tessa, who pretended to be brave but had a tendency to jump at her own shadow. And Caleb, the quiet one who'd go along with anything as long as it meant he didn't have to stay home. Together they formed a tight-knit group, Their weekends often filled with dares, pranks, and now, apparently, rituals. "This is so stupid," Alex muttered as they gathered in Mia's dimly lit basement. The room had a low ceiling, cluttered shelves, and a faint smell of mildew that only added to the eerie atmosphere. "It'll be fun," Mia replied, setting up the candles in a perfect circle on the cold concrete floor. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Nothing, because it's fake." "That's what they always say in horror movies," Tessa said, her voice wavering as she glanced around the room. "And then everyone ends up dead." "Oh, come on," Caleb said with a rare grin. "You're not scared, are you?" "No," Tessa replied quickly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Mia struck a match and lit the first candle, the tiny flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. One by one, she lit the rest, and the group sat cross-legged around the circle. The basement felt heavier now, the silence pressing against them, as if the room itself were holding its breath. "Okay, so what do we do?" Alex asked, leaning back on his hands. "We're supposed to ask questions," Mia said, pulling out her phone to reread the instructions. "The spirits answer by making the flames flicker. Simple." "Fine," Alex said with a sigh. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the candles. "Is there anyone here with us?" The flames remained steady. "See? Nothing," he said, sitting back with a smirk. "Maybe you have to be more specific," Tessa said, her eyes darting nervously between the candles. "Okay," Mia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If there are any spirits here, give us a sign." The candle's flames quivered, just slightly. Everyone froze. "Did you see that?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "It's probably just a draft," Alex said, though he shifted uncomfortably. Mia's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Let's keep going. Who are you?" The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. One of the candles flickered wildly, then steadied. "This is freaky," Tessa whispered, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a sudden chill. "Do you mean us harm?" Caleb asked, surprising everyone. He rarely spoke during their escapades, and the question hung in the air like a weight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, one of the candles went out. Tessa let out a yelp, and Alex scrambled back, knocking over a stack of old books. "What the hell?" he exclaimed. "Did you blow it out?" Mia asked, her voice sharp as she looked at Caleb, who shook his head vehemently. "They didn't touch it," he said. The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping so fast that their breaths began to mist in the faint light. The remaining candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing as if caught in an invisible wind. "We should stop," Tessa said, her voice high-pitched with panic. "We should stop right now." Mia hesitated, but before she could respond, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Everyone jumped, their eyes darting toward the door. "Who did that?" Alex demanded, his bravado crumbling. "It wasn't me," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it was a deep, vibrating drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, elongating unnaturally. "Blow out the candles," Tessa pleaded, her hands trembling as she reached for one of the flames. "Don't," Mia snapped, grabbing her wrist. "We don't know what will happen if we blow them all out." But it was too late. In her panic, Tessa had already exhaled, extinguishing the flame. The hum stopped. Silence enveloped the room, so absolute it felt suffocating. Then, slowly, the remaining candles began to dim, their light shrinking until the basement was plunged into near darkness. "Do you see that?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Everyone turned to look where he was pointing. In the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the rest seemed to shift and writhe, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. "Oh my God," Tessa breathed, clutching Alex's arm. The shadow moved, stepping closer, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. The final candle flickered weakly, then went out, leaving them in pitch blackness. And then the screaming began. It was chaos in the dark. Tessa's screams mingled with Alex's frantic cursing, and the sound of someone stumbling echoed through the basement. Mia fumbled for her phone, desperate for any source of light, but her fingers felt numb and clumsy. When she finally managed to turn on the flashlight, The beam illuminated the room and the shadow. It stood at the edge of the circle, its form vaguely human but disturbingly distorted. The head tilted unnaturally to one side, and the edges of its body seemed to flicker, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. The air around it was suffocatingly cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread seeped into every corner of the room. "What is that?" Caleb's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. "I don't know," Mia whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure. This wasn't supposed to happen." "No kidding," Alex snapped, his voice cracking. "How do we make it stop?" Mia's mind raced, but she couldn't think straight. The instructions hadn't mentioned anything like this. The forum had been vague, almost playful, about the ritual's outcomes. Gripping her chest. "The circle isn't complete without them." "Are you insane?" Alex shot back. "I'm not going near that thing." "Do you have a better idea?" Mia snapped, her voice rising. Before anyone could respond, the shadow moved again, stepping fully into the circle. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and the oppressive hum returned, low and menacing. Caleb let out a strangled cry and backed into the wall, his hands clawing at the cold concrete, as if trying to escape through it. "We're running out of time," Mia said, grabbing the matches from the floor. Her hands shook as she struck one, the tiny flame sputtering to life. She leaned forward to light the nearest candle, but just as the wick caught fire, a sudden gust of icy wind extinguished it. The shadow seemed to grow taller, its form looming over her. "Mia, don't," Tessa begged, tears streaming down her face. "What if it gets angry?" "It's already angry," Mia shot back, crawling to the next candle. She tried again, shielding the match with her hand, and this time the flame held. One candle down, 4 to go. The shadow let out a low, guttural sound that resonated deep in their chests. Alex pulled Tessa back, positioning himself between her and the figure, though his shaking hands betrayed his fear. "Hurry up," he yelled, his voice cracking. Mia scrambled to the next candle, lighting it with trembling hands. The room seemed to shift around them, the walls warping and bending as if the basement itself were coming alive. The shadow darted toward her, its movement unnervingly fast. But as the second candle flared to life, it recoiled slightly, its form flickering. "It's working," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "Keep going." Mia crawled to the third candle, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The matchbox slipped from her fingers, and she let out a frustrated cry as she fumbled to retrieve it. The shadow seized the opportunity, closing the distance between them. She could feel its presence pressing against her, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "Mia!" Tessa screamed. But before the shadow could reach her, Alex lunged forward, throwing the books from the overturned stack at it. The distraction was enough to give Mia a moment to light the third candle. Again, the shadow recoiled, its form flickering violently as if it were being torn apart. With renewed determination, Mia lit the fourth candle. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadow's movements became erratic. It thrashed within the circle, its form splintering and reforming, as if it were fighting to stay whole. "One more," Mia whispered, crawling to the final candle. Her hands were numb, her fingers barely able to hold the match. She struck it once, twice, and on the third try, the flame ignited. She leaned forward, shielding it with her body, and lit the fifth candle. The moment the flame caught, the hum stopped. The shadow let out an ear-splitting wail, its form collapsing in on itself. The candles flared brightly, their light searing, and then everything went dark. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by their ragged breaths. Slowly, Mia turned on her phone's flashlight. The shadow was gone, and the basement looked normal again, though the candles were nothing but melted wax puddles on the floor. "Is it over?" Tessa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mia nodded, though she didn't feel as confident as she looked. "I think so." But as they climbed the stairs and left the basement behind, none of them noticed the faint, dark stain on the concrete floor where the shadow had stood, slowly spreading outward. The old tome smelled of mildew and dust, its leather cover cracked from years of neglect. Amanda ran her fingers over the embossed title, Rituals of the Forgotten Ones. She had found the book in a dim corner of a second-hand shop, its price tag handwritten in shaky letters. Desperation drove her to buy it. After months of grieving for her husband, Daniel, who had died in a car accident, Amanda would try anything to ease the ache in her chest of the bizarre ritual described on page 113. Take dried flowers from a loved one's funeral, the instructions read. Amanda had saved the withered bouquet from Daniel's casket, unable to part with it. The petals, once white lilies and pale roses, had browned and curled, fragile as old parchment. Burn them under the full moon, the text continued, and whisper the words, return what is gone. Amanda glanced at the calendar. The full moon would rise that very night, its timing feeling eerily deliberate, as if fate itself had arranged the ritual stage. The book's final warning, written in faded ink, was easy to overlook in her grief-stricken state. Beware what returns is not what was lost. That evening, Amanda prepared the ritual. She gathered the brittle flowers and placed them in a metal bowl on her backyard patio. The moon loomed overhead, its light unnaturally bright, casting elongated shadows across the lawn. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. She lit a match and set the flowers ablaze. They caught quickly, their brittle petals curling into ash as an acrid, sweet scent wafted up. Heart-pounding, Amanda whispered the words, return what is gone. Her voice quivered, barely louder than the crackle of burning flowers. The flames flickered, casting eerie, shifting shapes on the walls of her house. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the fire, leaving the bowl's contents blackened and cold. The night grew still. No sound of crickets, no distant hum of cars, just silence, thick and suffocating. Amanda lingered for a moment, expecting something, but nothing happened. Disappointment mixed with guilt settled in her chest. What had she expected? Magic? Miracles? She sighed and carried the bowl inside, setting it on the kitchen table. Exhausted, she went to bed, tears dampening her pillow. Morning brought an unsettling surprise. When Amanda walked into the kitchen, she froze. There, on the table, sat the flowers. Not the brittle remains she had burned, but fresh blooms, vibrant and fragrant, as if they'd just been plucked. The lilies gleamed white, their petals soft to the touch, and the rose's crimson hue was almost unnatural in its intensity. Amanda's breath hitched. She stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. No, she whispered. Her mind raced for an explanation. Had she dreamed the ritual? Was this some cruel prank? But then her eyes shifted to the faint burn marks on the table, proof that the fire had been real. As she stared at the flowers, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A shadow loomed behind the bouquet, tall and distorted. Amanda's blood ran cold as the shadow stepped forward, resolving into a figure. Her heart clenched. It was Daniel. Or at least, it looked like him. His features were familiar, the strong jawline, the crooked smile she had loved so much, but something was off. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now dark and glassy, like pools of ink. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his movements were stiff, almost mechanical. Amanda, he said, his voice low and hollow. It echoed unnaturally, as if coming from a great distance. Amanda's legs gave out, and she collapsed into a chair, trembling. Daniel? She whispered, barely able to speak. Tears blurred her vision. Is it really you? He tilted his head, his smile widening into something that sent a shiver down her spine. You called for me, he said. I'm here. Amanda reached out, her hand trembling. But as her fingers grazed his, she recoiled. His skin was ice cold, the texture wrong too smooth, too rigid, like porcelain. What are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's smile faltered, his expression darkening. You don't recognize me? He asked, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. You brought me back. Amanda's mind screamed at her to run, to get away from this thing that wore her husband's face. But she couldn't move, paralyzed by fear and confusion. This isn't right, she said, shaking her head. You're not him. Daniel's expression twisted into something monstrous. His features seemed to ripple, his skin bubbling and stretching unnaturally. His once familiar face warped, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets, his mouth elongating into a grotesque grin. "You wanted me back," he snarled, his voice a guttural growl. "And now I'm here," Amanda screamed, stumbling to her feet and backing away. But the shadowy figure, no longer resembling Daniel in any way, advanced, its movements jerky and inhuman. The flowers on the table began to wither, their vibrant colors draining away, as if consumed by the dark presence in the room. A sudden knock at the front door broke the tension. Amanda's head snapped toward the sound, her heart hammering. She turned back to the shadow, but it was gone. The room was empty, the flowers reduced to a pile of ash. Her hands shook as she approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the empty street. Slowly, she opened the door, the morning sunlight spilling in. On the porch lay a single white lily, fresh and dewy, as if it had just been picked. Amanda's chest tightened. She backed away, slamming the door shut. But when she turned around, the kitchen table was no longer empty. The flowers were back, vibrant and whole, and the air was heavy with their cloying scent. Amanda's legs gave out as the shadow reappeared behind the bouquet, taller and more distorted than before. The sound of her own heartbeat roared in her ears as the shadow whispered, "You cannot undo what you've done." Amanda barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. She kept her bedroom door locked, but it offered little comfort. The image of the shadowy figure and the fresh flowers haunted her, looping endlessly in her mind. She didn't dare go back to the kitchen. When dawn finally broke, Amanda ventured out of her room cautiously. The house was eerily silent, the air heavy and oppressive. Her stomach churned as she peeked into the kitchen. The flowers were gone, replaced by an empty, scorched table. Relief flooded her momentarily, but it was short-lived. As she brewed coffee, a faint whisper brushed her ear. "Amanda." The cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the tiled floor. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath quickened, and she clutched the counter for support. The voice had been unmistakable. It was Daniel's. She couldn't stay here. Amanda grabbed her keys and fled the house, not bothering to lock the door. She drove aimlessly, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching her. Eventually, she found herself at the cemetery where Daniel was buried. His grave was well kept, the headstone polished and adorned with fresh flower lilies and roses, just like the ones that had appeared on her table. Her legs felt like lead as she approached. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was deafening. When she reached the grave, she froze. The flowers weren't just fresh, they were the exact same bouquet she had burned during the ritual. Amanda's mind raced. How could they be here? Had someone dug them up? But the soil around the grave was undisturbed. "You shouldn't have done it," a voice rasped behind her. Amanda whipped around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have called me back." Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. The world seemed to tilt, the shadows around her deepening unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and incoherent, until they became a deafening roar. Amanda screamed, covering her ears, but the noise was inside her head. Fragments of words. "Not him," "a doorway," "can't close it," and then silence. Amanda opened her eyes to find herself alone. The graveyard was still, bathed in pale morning light. She stumbled to her feet and fled, her heart racing. But as she reached her car, she saw it. A figure stood in the distance, near the tree line. It was Daniel, or what looked like him, watching her with those dark, glassy eyes. The next few days were a blur of terror. Amanda couldn't escape the feeling that she was being followed. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Whispers echoed through the house, and the scent of lilies and roses lingered no matter how many windows she opened. Answers, flipping past rituals and warnings she had ignored the first time. Finally, she found a section titled "Reversing the Unnatural." The instructions were vague, written in cryptic language, but one line stood out: to sever the tie, offer what was taken, and abandon the tether. Amanda's hands trembled. She interpreted it to mean she had to return the flowers, but where? And what was the tether? She searched her memory, piecing together every detail of the ritual. The flowers, the fire, the words she had spoken. It all pointed back to the place where it began. That night, she prepared for the reversal. She retrieved the flowers from the table, now dry and brittle again, and placed them in the same metal bowl. The full moon was gone, replaced by a thin crescent, but Amanda couldn't wait another month. She carried the bowl to the backyard, her breath visible in the cold night air. "To sever the tie," she whispered, her voice cracking. She lit a match and dropped it into the bowl. The flowers burned quickly, the flames dancing higher than before. The air grew thick, pressing against her chest. Amanda choked on the smoke, which swirled unnaturally, forming shapes that flickered at the edge of her vision. "Offer what was taken," she said, her voice barely audible. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Daniel's wedding ring, the only piece of him she had kept after his death. Tears streamed down her face as she dropped it into the fire. The flames roared, turning from orange to an unnatural blue. The shapes in the smoke solidified, forming grotesque faces that screamed silently. Amanda fell to her knees, shielding her eyes. The wind howled, whipping around her violently, and then, as quickly as it started, the fire died. When Amanda looked up, the bowl was empty. The flowers, the ring, everything had vanished. The air was still. The oppressive weight lifted. She stood shakily, looking around. The backyard was silent, the shadows no longer menacing. For the first time in days, Amanda felt a glimmer of hope. She turned to go back inside, but froze. There in the doorway stood Daniel. He looked more human now, his features softer, his eyes less dark, but he was still wrong. He didn't belong here. "Amanda," he said, his voice calm but hollow, "you can't undo this." Before she could react, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for her. Amanda screamed and stumbled back, tripping over the empty bowl. She scrambled to her feet and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. The windows rattled as the wind picked up again, the shadows outside swirling violently. Amanda locked herself in the bathroom, her chest heaving. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the pale, wide-eyed woman staring back. The whispers began again, faint but persistent. "Return what is gone. Return what is gone." Amanda's heart sank as she realized the truth. The ritual couldn't be undone. She had opened a door, and it would never close. Outside, the wind howled, and the scent of lilies filled the air once more. It started on a cold October night, the kind of night when the wind whispers secrets through the trees, and the moon hides behind a veil of clouds. Emily sat cross-legged on the carpet of her best friend, Rachel's dimly lit room. The group of 4 girls, Emily, Rachel, Jenna, and Sophie had spent the evening swapping ghost stories. But Rachel, always the bold one, wanted something more. "Let's do it," Rachel said, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Let's see our future reflections." Jenna rolled her eyes. "That's just a dumb urban legend." Sophie nervously fiddled with her bracelet. "Maybe we shouldn't. What if something bad happens?" But Emily, caught between skepticism and curiosity, found herself nodding along with Rachel's enthusiasm. It was harmless fun, right? What could go wrong? Rachel grabbed a thick, dusty book from her bookshelf. "I read about it in here," she said, flipping through the pages until she found the right one. "It's simple. You light a candle, stand in front of a mirror, and say these words." She cleared her throat dramatically. "Show me what is yet to be. Let me see what's meant for me. Then you wait." Emily hesitated. "And what's supposed to happen?" Rachel shrugged. "Your reflection moves on its own and shows you your future. Or nothing happens, and we all get a good laugh." After a round of dares and cajoling, it was Emily who ended up volunteering. Her heart raced as Rachel handed her a stubby white candle and guided her to the full-length mirror leaning against the wall. The other girls sat on the bed, watching with bated breath. Emily lit the candle, the flame casting flickering shadows across her face. She stared at her reflection, her own wide brown eyes staring back, the light painting ghostly shapes in the mirror's surface. She whispered the words, Show me what is yet to be. Let me see what's meant for me. At first, nothing happened. The silence in the room stretched thin, broken only by the sound of the candle's faint crackle. Emily exhaled, half relieved, half disappointed. See? Nothing. Her reflection blinked. Emily froze. She hadn't blinked. The version of herself in the mirror was staring straight at her, unblinking and unbroken, while she stood paralyzed. "Guys," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see that?" The other girls leaned forward, their faces pale. "It's probably just a trick of the light," Rachel said, but her voice wavered. The reflection began to move, slowly at first, lifting its arm and tilting its head. But Emily hadn't moved an inch. The mirror. Emily's lips curled into a smirk, one that was both familiar and foreign. Then it spoke. "I liked you," it said, the voice raspy and low, nothing like Emily's own. "Now you are mine." Emily stumbled back, the candle nearly falling from her hand. The flame flickered wildly, but it didn't go out. The reflection reached a hand toward the glass, pressing its palm against the surface. Emily's stomach churned as the glass rippled like water. "Blow out the candle!" Sophie screamed. But Emily's hands were trembling too much to react. She watched in horror as her reflection began to climb out of the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. The room grew colder, the air heavy with the scent of burnt hair. The lights overhead flickered, then died, plunging the girls into near darkness. Only the candle's glow remained, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Emily, get away from it!" Jenna shouted. But Emily couldn't move. The reflection was halfway out now, its features warped and wrong. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide. Finally, Rachel lunged forward and grabbed the candle from Emily's hand. She blew it out with one frantic breath, and the room was plunged into pitch black. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of scraping, like nails on a chalkboard. The girls huddled together, their breathing shallow. Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she whispered, "Is it gone?" A low chuckle echoed through the room. "You can't get rid of me that easily," the voice rasped. The girls screamed as the mirror shattered, shards of glass flying across the room. In the fractured pieces scattered on the floor, Emily could still see the reflection's face, staring back at her from 1,000 angles. "What do we do?" Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. Rachel grabbed the book, frantically flipping through the pages. There has to be something in here, a way to reverse it. But before she could find anything, the room seemed to twist around them. The walls bent inward, the ceiling stretched higher, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The shards of glass began to vibrate, the reflections within them moving independently, their mouths opening in silent screams. Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. "Please stop this," she begged, but the voice only laughed. "You invited me," it said, "and now I'm here to stay." The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The girls scrambled toward it, pounding and screaming, but it wouldn't budge. The reflection's laughter filled the room, echoing off the warped walls. Rachel's hands shook as she read from the book. "To banish the reflection, you must," her voice faltered, "you must sacrifice something pure." All eyes turned to Sophie, the youngest and most innocent among them. She shook her head violently. "No, I'm not. I can't." Before anyone could react, the reflection's arm shot out from a shard of glass, grabbing Sophie by the wrist. She screamed as it began to pull her toward the mirror's remains. "Help me," she cried, but the others were frozen in terror. Emily, shaking with adrenaline, grabbed the candle and held the flame to the shard. The glass hissed and cracked, and the reflection let out an ear-piercing shriek. The room seemed to implode, the walls snapping back into place, the air returning to normal. The mirror was gone, reduced to nothing but ash, and the reflection was nowhere to be seen. The girls sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should never have done this." Emily nodded, her hands still trembling. "It's over now, right?" But deep down, she wasn't sure, because in the corner of her eye, just for a moment, she thought she saw her reflection move.